A sailboat at anchor moves in the same slow circle, night after night, following the tide without anyone awake to watch it. The wind shifts, the chain adjusts, and the boat swings, unhurried, faithful, working through the dark, exactly as it was designed to. The anchor is set. The sails are furled along the boom, their sheets hanging loose in the evening air. The boat is a 38-foot sloop, white hull, teak cockpit, a small blue dodger over the companionway that catches the last warmth of the sun as it drops behind the headland. The cove is quiet. 2 other boats are anchored nearby, their reflections lengthening on the water as the light changes, and the whole scene has the settled quality of something that has been doing this for a very long time and intends to keep doing it without any particular help from anyone. If this is the kind of thing you find yourself drawn to, the quiet world of wind and water, the slow physics of vessels at rest, then this channel is for you. Subscribe to Simple Science and settle in. Everything we make is designed to carry you gently towards sleep. The anchor chain descends from the bow roller in a catenary curve, not straight, but bowed downward in a gentle arc before it disappears into the water. The catenary is not a decorative feature. It is an engineering function. The curve allows the chain to absorb shock loads. When a gust hits the boat and the chain comes under sudden tension, the links straighten slightly, absorbing energy the way a spring absorbs it, before the chain goes fully taut and the anchor feels the load. This is why anchoring with chain is preferred over anchoring with rope alone, for overnight late stays. The catenary works for the boat while the crew sleeps. As the tide turns, the boat swings. This happens slowly enough that it is almost imperceptible from inside the cabin. The tidal current that ran one way through the anchorage for the past 6 hours has slackened to nothing, and now the water is beginning to move in the other direction. The boat, which has been pointing into the current with its bow pointed west, begins to turn. The chain, which has been running straight out from the bow in the direction of the anchor on the bottom, begins to ease. The boat comes through the turn and settles again, pointing east, the chain retightening as the current builds against the hull and pushes it downwind of the anchor. The anchor barely moves. It has been set in a sandy patch 8 meters down, and the horizontal pull of the chain keeps it pressed into the seabed. This cycle repeats twice in every 24 hours and 50 minutes. The duration of the lunar day, the period in which the moon completes one orbit relative to the sun. Each tidal cycle is approximately 12 hours and 25 minutes. High water comes, then ebb, then low water, then flood. The boat swings with each reversal, describing slow arcs across the anchorage, always coming back to rest, pointing into whatever direction the current is running at that moment. Below decks, the sounds of a boat at anchor have a specific quality. There is the low creak of the hull, moving very slightly in the swell that enters the cove from the open sea. There is the occasional tap of a halyard against the aluminum mast, a sound that carries a long way across calm water, and that experienced sailors learn to tie off before sleeping so it doesn't. There is the gentle sound of water against the hull, not breaking, not slapping, but moving alongside the waterline with the slow persistence of the tide. And beneath all of it, almost below the threshold of hearing, the faint metallic conversation of the anchor chain as the links settle and shift against each other on the seabed. The boat is a machine that requires nothing from you right now. The anchor is holding. The tide is doing its work. The chain is in the water. Every system is performing exactly as it should, without supervision, without adjustment, without anyone needing to be awake to make sure. Outside, the last light has left the headland and the cove is moving into full dark. The stars are beginning to appear in the band above the hills to the east. The other two boats in the anchorage have their anchor lights on. White lights at the bow, required by the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, to show that a vessel is at anchor. And their reflections move slowly in the water as the current builds. The boat swings. The chain hangs in its curve. The night is settling. Everything is in its right place. The boat at anchor last night was performing a technology that is approximately 5,500 years old. The chain, the hull, the lead keel, all of these are recent innovations by the standards of maritime history. The sail is older than any of them. The oldest known image of a sail in the world appears on a pottery vessel found at Gerseh in Egypt and dates to between 3300 and 3100 BCE. The image shows a single square sail mounted on a mast, positioned well forward toward the prow of the vessel, set against what appears to be a schematic river scene. The pot itself is predynastic Egyptian, made before the first pharaoh unified the country, before the pyramids existed, before writing had fully developed. But the sail is already there, already recognizable as the device it was, already doing its work of catching the wind. The logic of the first sail is the logic of the Nile. The river flows north toward the Mediterranean, driven by gravity and the snowmelt of the Ethiopian highlands. Travel downstream from the interior towards the sea was simple. You went with the current, using oars for steering and correction, letting the water do the work. But travel upstream, southward into the interior, against a current that could run at several knots in flood season was hard labour. It required many oarsmen pulling constantly against the flow. Someone noticed that the wind on the Nile blows predominantly from the north toward the south. This is one of the most consistent and reliable wind patterns in the region, driven by the Mediterranean air mass and the desert heat inland. The river flows north. The wind blows south. Between them, they offered a complete transport system, if only the upstream problem could be solved. The square sail solved it. Raise a piece of cloth on a mast, let the north wind fill it, and the force of the air on the fabric pushes the boat upstream, against the current, without the oarsman doing anything except trimming the sail and steering. You could go downstream with the current and upstream with the wind. The Nile became a two-way road, and the entire economic and cultural geography of ancient Egypt reorganized itself around that fact. The Egyptian hieroglyphic writing system encodes this understanding in a beautiful detail. The hieroglyph for traveling north shows a boat with its sail lowered, because going north meant going with the current, and the sail was not needed. The hieroglyph for traveling south shows a boat with its sail raised, because going south meant sailing into the wind. The ancient Egyptians understood the relationship between wind, current, and sail well enough that it shaped the symbols they used to describe direction itself. The square sail carried by those early Nile boats was simple in its mechanics. A horizontal yard, suspended from the mast, held the top edge of the sail. The wind filled the fabric from behind, and the pressure it generated pushed the boat forward. This works well when the wind is coming from behind or from the side, but becomes ineffective and eventually impossible as you try to sail closer to the direction the wind is coming from. The square sail cannot sail toward the wind. It requires the wind to be at least a beam, or more commonly from behind, to generate useful drive. This limitation was not a problem on the Nile, where the wind comes from one consistent direction, and the river itself provides the return journey. But it would become the central engineering challenge of sailing over the following 5 millennia, as ships moved from rivers to open oceans, where the wind could come from any direction at any time, and you could not always wait for it to come from the right quarter. The answer to that challenge is the fore and aft sail, a sail that orients along the length of the boat rather than across it, and which can be trimmed tight and used as an aerodynamic surface to generate lift sideways to the wind, allowing the boat to make progress toward the wind, even if it cannot sail directly into it. This development, the shift from a purely downwind device to an aerodynamic wing, is arguably the most important single advance in the history of sailing. But it began here, on a pottery vessel from predynastic Egypt, a simple square of cloth on a wooden pole, catching the north wind above a river that flowed the other way. The Nile is still there, the wind still blows from the north. The same relationship between air and water that shaped a civilization is the same one at work tonight in the anchorage, pushing gently on the furled sails, pulling softly at the halyard, reminding the boat that the wind has not changed its mind about any of this in 500 years. The most counterintuitive fact about sailing is that a sailboat can travel toward the wind, not directly into it. No sailboat can do that, but at an angle to it, close enough to make progress against the wind's direction through a zigzagging course called tacking. A sailboat is not just pushed by the wind, it is, in some configurations, flown by it. To understand this, you need to abandon the intuitive model of a sail as a bucket catching air. That model works only when the wind is coming from behind the boat, filling the sail like a bag and pushing the whole apparatus forward by pressure. It describes what was happening on the Nile 5,500 years ago. It does not describe what happens when a modern sailboat is sailing at 45 degrees to the wind. When the wind strikes a sail at an angle, the sail acts as an aerofoil. The curved surface of the sail creates a situation in which air flowing across the outside of the curve travels faster than air flowing across the inside. Faster moving air generates lower pressure than slower moving air. The lower pressure on the outside of the curved sail pulls it outward, just as the lower pressure above a curved aeroplane wing pulls the wing upward. This creates a force perpendicular to the surface of the sail, which can be resolved into a component that drives the boat forward and a component that pushes the boat sideways. The sideways component is what the keel addresses, as we will discuss in the next chapter. The forward component is what makes sailing into the wind not just possible, but efficient. On a close-hauled course, a sailboat sailing as close to the wind as it can, at roughly 30 to 45 degrees from the wind's direction. The aerodynamic lift generated by the sail is actually greater than the drag pushing backward, and the boat moves forward. The deeper the curve of the sail, and the finer the tuning of its angle to the wind, the more efficiently this lift is generated. Sailors describe the relationship between the boat and the wind in terms of points of sail. There are 6, each named according to the angle between the boat's heading and the wind direction. In irons is not a point of sail at all. It is the dead zone. The arc of roughly 45 degrees either side of the wind direction where no sail configuration generates enough drive to move the boat. A sailboat pointed directly into the wind stalls and stops, its sails flapping uselessly. Ancient sailors called this being in irons, and it was to be avoided. Close-hauled is the tightest angle to the wind on which the boat can still make progress, roughly 30 to 45 degrees from the wind, sails trimmed flat, the boat heeled over, spray off the bow. Close reach is a slightly freer angle, 60 to 70 degrees from the wind. The boat stands a little straighter, picks up speed, and the helm lightens. Beam reach puts the wind at exactly 90 degrees to the boat's course. Many sailors describe this as the sweetest point of sail. Fast, balanced, comfortable. The sails eased to halfway out, the boat upright and purposeful. Broad reach brings the wind from behind and to one side, at 120 to 160 degrees. The boat is sailing downwind at an angle, and if a spinnaker is available, it is deployed here, a large balloon of sail forward of the forestay that fills with wind and generates enormous drag-based drive. Running is the pure downwind course, the wind directly behind the boat. This is closest to the bucket model. The sail fills and pushes, but it is actually often slower than a broad reach because the apparent wind experienced by the sails is reduced when the boat is running away from the wind at speed. The concept of apparent wind is what separates sailing from most intuitive conceptions of it. As the boat moves forward, it generates its own headwind. The wind the sails actually feel is a combination of the true wind from the environment and the headwind created by the boat's motion. This combined wind, the apparent wind, is always forward of the true wind when the boat is moving. It is what the sails are trimmed to, what the telltales respond to, what the masthead wind indicator shows. Managing the relationship between apparent wind and true wind is one of the core skills of helmsmanship, particularly at higher speeds where the difference between the two becomes large. No sailboat can sail directly into the wind, but by tacking, sailing close-hauled on one side of the wind, then changing course to sail close-hauled on the other side, a sailboat can reach any destination, no matter which direction the wind is blowing. The course traced across the water looks like a zigzag, but the progress made is real. In 5,500 years of sailing, this is what changed. The sail evolved from a bag that could only go downwind into a wing that can go almost anywhere. When the wind strikes the sail at an angle and generates lift, as described in the previous chapter, It does not only drive the boat forward, it also pushes the boat sideways. And if the boat simply slid sideways through the water under this force, all the forward drive from the sail would be wasted. The boat, moving across the water like a leaf on a pond, rather than toward its destination. The keel is the answer to this problem. Hanging below the hull of every keelboat, extending downward into the water, the keel is a hydrodynamic foil, a wing oriented vertically that works in water the same way the sail works in air. As the boat is pushed sideways by the wind pressure on the sail, the water flows over and under the keel's angled surfaces. This flow generates lift perpendicular to the keel's surface, which opposes the sideways force from the sail. The two forces balance each other, and what remains is a net forward force. The boat moves forward instead of sideways. This interaction is the heart of why sailing upwind works. Without the keel, the aerodynamic forces from the sail would have nowhere to go. With it, the sail's sideways pressure becomes forward motion. The keel does a second job equally important and more immediately obvious to anyone who has watched a sailboat heeling in a breeze. It carries ballast. The lower half or bulb of a keelboat's keel is made of lead or cast iron, dense and heavy, installed as low as possible below the waterline. A typical cruising sailboat has 35 to 45% of its total displacement in ballast, concentrated in the keel. Lead, which is 1.5 times denser than iron, is preferred when budget allows, because the same weight can be concentrated in a smaller volume, placing the center of gravity as low as possible. This low center of gravity is what gives a keelboat its self-righting characteristic. When the wind heels the boat over, when the sails tip the mast toward the water, and the hull lifts on one side, the heavy keel, hanging below the waterline, creates a righting moment. The further the boat heels, the longer the lever arm between the keel's weight and the boat's center of rotation, and the stronger the righting force pulling the mast back toward vertical. A properly designed keelboat cannot capsize permanently. If it is knocked completely flat by a sudden squall, with the mast horizontal above the water, the keel's righting moment will bring it back upright. If it is rolled completely inverted by an extreme wave, mast pointing straight down, the same righting moment still exists, weaker at that angle, but still present, and will eventually right the boat. This is why the solo circumnavigators, discussed in later chapters, were able to survive storms in the Southern Ocean that would have been fatal in any other kind of vessel. The keel kept working even in conditions where nothing else could. The depth of the keel, its draft, is a direct function of how much righting moment the designer wanted to create. The deeper the keel, the longer the lever arm, the more stability at a given ballast weight, and the better the boat will sail upwind, because the keel's hydrodynamic lift is also greater. Racing sailboats have very deep, narrow keels, sometimes with a heavy lead bulb at the tip, to maximize both stability and hydrodynamic efficiency. Cruising boats compromise between depth, which makes the boat stable and weatherly, and shallow draft, which allows access to anchorages and harbours that deep-keeled boats cannot enter. The word keel comes from the Old Norse kjol, which itself derives from the Proto-Germanic term for the central longitudinal structural member of a boat's hull. For most of naval history, the keel was the backbone of the boat. The long timber or steel bar running from stem to stern along the bottom, to which the ribs and planking were attached. The ballasted keel we are discussing is a different object, an external appendage bolted to the hull's underside, but it inherited the name. There is something satisfying in the keel's invisibility. Below the waterline, hidden from view, it is the largest and heaviest component of the boat. Every quality that makes a keelboat safe, stable, and able to sail into the wind traces back to this dark, dense fin hanging silently below, doing two jobs at once, resisting the sideways push of the wind and pulling the boat back upright every time the wind tries to lay it flat. The boat, at anchor tonight, has its keel, resting in the same silted dark as the anchor. Both are doing their work without being asked. In the 1840s, tea became fast. Not the tea itself, which brews at the same pace it always has, but the business of getting it from China to Britain. Victorian tea drinkers developed a fashion for the first cargo of the new season's harvest, the freshest tea, with the best flavour, uncompromised by months in a hold. The market paid a premium for the first chests to arrive in London each year. A difference of days in the crossing could mean a difference of thousands of pounds in the price the cargo commanded. And so the shipowners instructed their designers to build faster ships, and the designers built the clippers. The clipper ship was the apex of commercial sail technology. A three-masted, square-rigged vessel with a narrow, sharp hull designed to minimize water resistance, carrying an enormous area of canvas on tall masts, built for speed rather than cargo capacity. Where earlier cargo ships had broad bluff hulls that could pack in maximum tonnage at the expense of performance, the clipper sacrificed some cargo space to go faster. Its hull shape was unlike anything that had preceded it, a concave bow that cut into the water rather than pushing against it, and a clean run aft that let the water release from the hull with minimal drag. The Cutty Sark, launched on November 22nd, 1869, in Dumbarton, Scotland, is the most famous survivor. She was 212 feet and 5 inches long, 36 feet wide, and had a net tonnage of 963 tons. Her owner, London shipowner John Willis, built her with one specific aim: to be faster than the Thermopylae, her great rival on the China run. She was fitted with 32 sails, covering a combined area of approximately 3,000 square meters. In the right conditions, she could reach 17 knots, roughly 31 kilometers per hour, under full sail. Her first voyage departed London for Shanghai in February 1870, and her hold came back loaded with 1.3 million pounds of tea. The competition between the clippers on the China run was genuinely fierce, and the 1872 race between the Cutty Sark and the Thermopylae became the most famous contest in commercial sailing history. Both ships loaded their cargoes simultaneously on June 17th, 1872, in Shanghai, and set off for London. The Cutty Sark held a lead for much of the voyage, but lost her rudder in the Indian Ocean during a storm, and was forced to improvise a jury rudder from spare timber to complete the journey. The Thermopylae arrived first by a week. Had the Cutty Sark kept her rudder, the outcome might have been different. The Cutty Sark never had the chance to conclusively prove herself. Her career on the China run coincided almost exactly with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. Steam-powered ships could use the Suez Canal and its favourable route. Sailing ships could not, because the Red Sea offered unfavourable winds and the canal passage itself would require towing. The clippers were committed to the long way around via the Cape of Good Hope, while steamships cut thousands of miles off the journey through the canal. Within a decade, the tea trade had largely moved to steam. The Cutty Sark found her second career in the Australian wool trade, which she dominated through the 1880s. The wool run suited her better in some ways. The routes from Australia to England allowed her to work the consistent roaring 40s winds of the Southern Ocean, which is where a clipper's speed was most useful. She carried more than 45,000 bales of wool in her career on those routes and became the fastest ship on the run. In 1887, under Captain Richard Woodgate, she achieved the record passage from Australia to England of 73 days. The golden age of the clipper ships lasted roughly 30 years, from the early 1840s to the early 1870s. It was brief by any historical measure, sandwiched between the era of traditional cargo sailing and the era of steam. The clippers were not replaced because they were slow. They were replaced because steamships, initially slower and less reliable, became cheaper to operate per ton of cargo as engine technology improved and the Suez route opened. A coal-burning engine was more predictable than the wind, and predictability was what commerce needed. The Cutty Sark is now in dry dock at Greenwich, London, preserved under a glass canopy, her hull stabilised and her rigging restored. She is the only surviving tea clipper. Her 3 masts rise above the river, Thames not far from the meridian line, still pointing upward in the same posture they had when she was running before the roaring 40s at 17 knots, the Southern Ocean green and white behind her, the wool stacked in her hold, the wind filling every scrap of her 3,000 square meters of canvas. The acoustic world of a sailboat underway is unlike any other sound environment a person regularly inhabits. It begins before the boat is moving. In a marina berth, the boat is relatively quiet. The occasional creak of fenders, the soft knock of neighbouring boats, the metallic percussion of halyards against masts, in an anchorage full of yachts. But once clear of the harbour, once the sails are up and the engine is off, the sound environment transforms completely. The dominant sound is water, not the loud, percussive water of surf or rapids, but the continuous, complex conversation of water moving along a hull. At low speeds, in light conditions, it is almost a whisper, a gentle hiss along the waterline, the sound of the bow parting the surface into 2 small waves that trail away on either side. As speed increases, this sound deepens and widens. At hull speed, the sound of water on the hull is present throughout the entire length of the boat, each part of the underwater surface contributing its own frequency to the mixture. If you put your ear against the inner surface of a fiberglass hull, while the boat is moving at 5 or 6 knots, the sound you hear is dense and complex, a continuous spectrum from low rumble to high hiss. The rigging adds its own layer, wire shrouds and stays, the tensioned cables that hold the mast in place, vibrate in the wind at frequencies determined by their length and tension, the way a string vibrates when plucked. In light winds, this produces a low, mournful hum, the classic sound of standing rigging in a breeze, that varies pitch as the wind builds and drops. In stronger winds, the sound sharpens and rises. Sailors who have spent time at sea learn to read the wind by the sound of the rigging, the way other people read it by looking at the water. A shift in pitch tells them before any instrument does that the wind is increasing. The sails themselves are largely silent when they are full and properly trimmed. A well-set sail, with the right curve for the conditions and the sheets trimmed to the correct angle, makes almost no sound. The cloth is taut, the airflow is attached, and the aerodynamic work is proceeding without audible drama. The noise comes when the trim is wrong, the leading edge of the sail begins to flutter. A rapid staccato shivering of the fabric that is called luffing, and the sound it makes is immediate and specific, a signal to adjust the sheet or bear away. Experienced sailors react to that sound before they consciously process it. Below decks, the sound environment shifts. The hull muffles the rigging, but amplifies the water. At sea, in a moderate wind, the sound inside the cabin is dominated by a continuous low-frequency surge that builds and releases as waves pass under the hull. A breaking wave against the side of the boat produces a sharp, resonant impact that seems to come from everywhere simultaneously. The hull transmitting the percussion of water into the fiberglass, into the air inside the cabin, with virtually no attenuation. In heavy weather, this becomes a persistent and significant presence in the cabin, the boat speaking the language of the sea directly into the enclosed space where the crew is sleeping, cooking, navigating. Night sailing has its own acoustic quality. The visual information that occupies daytime sailing is diminished or absent, and the ears become primary. The wind angle, the sea state, the speed, the boat's behavior, all of this can be read from sound alone by someone who has sailed enough. The particular pitch of the bow wave tells you the speed without looking at the log. The sound of the rigging tells you the apparent wind without looking at the masthead instrument. The creak of a winch handle in its socket, or the knock of something loose in a locker, or the specific rhythm of the boat's motion through waves. All of it is information, and all of it arrives through sound. And then, occasionally, the wind drops at night. The sails fill and empty with the swell. The boat slows. The water noise at the hull reduces to almost nothing. The rigging goes quiet. In this near silence, the sounds that were beneath the noise become audible. The movement of water against the rudder, so soft it is almost felt rather than heard. The slow tick of the compass in its card. The breathing of someone asleep below. The world reduced to its quietest register. The boat carrying the night around it. The water holding its shape under the hull. And the stars doing whatever stars do when nobody is watching. On August 27th, 1966, a 64-year-old man sailed out of Plymouth Harbour and turned left. His name was Francis Chichester. His boat was a 53-foot ketch named Gypsy Moth Fauve, designed by John Illingworth and built at Camper and Nicholson's in Southampton. His intention was to sail solo around the world via the three great capes: the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Leeuwin at the southwestern tip of Australia, and Cape Horn, and to do it faster than the old clipper ships had managed with full crews. He wanted to beat the best clipper time of approximately 100 days for the run from England to Australia. He was 64 years old, had survived cancer, and had been told by doctors some years earlier that he had at most a year to live. He had then proceeded to win the first single-handed transatlantic race in 1960. The voyage began badly. Gypsy Moth Afov had been designed to Chichester's demanding specifications: maximum sail area in minimum rigging, the ability to be steered from his bunk, a self-steering system that could manage the boat while he slept. But the boat proved difficult from the start. It was directionally unstable, requiring constant attention to keep on course, and the self-steering gear struggled in heavy weather. In the Bay of Biscay, barely a week out of Plymouth, Chichester encountered gales that knocked the boat around and exhausted him. Later, in the South Atlantic, his autopilot failed when he was still 2,300 miles from Sydney. Despite this, he arrived in Sydney on December 12, 1966, having sailed 14,100 miles in 107 days. He had beaten the clipper time. 250,000 people watched from the harbour foreshores as Gypsy Moth Afov came in. Sydney gave him a hero's welcome and 5 weeks of rest and reprovisioning. The boat was modified, the keel was adjusted for better stability, the self-steering gear was repaired. On January 29, 1967, Chichester sailed again, this time south and east, toward Cape Horn. The second leg of the voyage covered 517 miles, the longest non-stop passage ever made by a small yacht at the time, and included the rounding of Cape Horn on March 22, 1967. Cape Horn is at the southern tip of South America, where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans meet in the most savage sea conditions on the planet. The wind is consistently from the west and southwest, channeled through the Drake Passage between South America and Antarctica, with no land to moderate it. The waves in the Drake Passage are the largest regular ocean waves on Earth. Chichester described Cape Horn in his book, Gypsy Moth Circles the World, as something that had frightened him for years. For a long time, I told myself that anyone trying to round the Horn on a small yacht must be mad. He rounded it anyway, in moderate conditions for the Horn, though still rough by any other standard. Then 119 days at sea from Sydney to Plymouth, the long diagonal track northward through the South Atlantic, the equatorial crossing, the final run north past the Azores and across the Bay of Biscay. He arrived back in Plymouth on May 28, 1967. 250,000 people were on the foreshore again. The Royal Navy sent a ship to escort him in. In total, Chichester had sailed 500 miles in 226 days of sailing, with one stop in Sydney. He had set 7 records. He had done it at 64 years old, having begun the voyage already famous, and having returned a legend. Queen Elizabeth II knighted him at Greenwich on July 7th, 1967. For the ceremony, she used the sword that had belonged to Sir Francis Drake, the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe with a crew, 4 centuries earlier. The symbolism was deliberate. Chichester himself described Gypsy Moth Afov with characteristic honesty, as a difficult and cantankerous vessel. "Too big for me," he wrote. "She is cantankerous and difficult and needs a crew of 3, a man to navigate, an elephant to move the tiller, and a chimpanzee to get about below and work some of the gear." The boat sailed around the world anyway. A solo sailor cannot sail and sleep simultaneously. This is a problem that must be solved before any long-distance, single-handed passage becomes possible, because a human being cannot stay awake indefinitely, and the ocean does not pause to let them rest. The answer is the self-steering gear, a mechanical system that allows the boat to maintain a consistent course without human input for hours or days at a time, without electrical power, without computers, and without failure. Modes that can strand a sleeping sailor in a dangerous situation. The most common and most reliable form of self-steering for offshore sailing is the wind vane system. A wind vane works by reading the angle between the boat's heading and the wind direction, and using any deviation from the desired angle to activate a correction to the steering. The basic principle has several mechanical configurations, but the most effective and widely used is the pendulum servo vane. A small vertical vane rises above the stern of the boat and is set to align with the apparent wind at the desired angle. When the boat wanders off course, when the wind angle changes because the boat has veered, the vane rotates slightly. This rotation is mechanically linked to a small paddle in the water, which swings sideways under the hydrodynamic force of the passing water. The swing of this paddle is amplified through a linkage to the boat's tiller or wheel, applying the steering correction. The entire system is driven by the energy of the wind and the water. It uses no electricity. It has no electronic components that can fail. It responds instantly to changes in wind angle and does not get tired. Its only limitation is that it steers relative to the wind rather than relative to a compass course. If the wind shifts, the boat's course shifts with it, because the system is maintaining a constant angle to the wind rather than a constant compass heading. In practice, this is usually acceptable for offshore sailing, where the destination is far enough of a way that a few degrees of course variation is easily corrected when the watchkeeper wakes. The wind vane was the technology that made Francis Chichester's voyage possible. Without a reliable self-steering system, a solo sailor cannot sleep for more than a few minutes without the boat wandering off course. With a well-set vane, the boat can sail itself for a full watch, 3 hours, 4 hours, sometimes more in stable conditions. The sailor wakes at intervals to check the position, trim the sails, note any shipping traffic, and go back below. Chichester's system was designed on principles worked out by Colonel Hasler, known as Blondie Hasler, who had developed wind vane self-steering for the first single-handed transatlantic race in 1960. Hasler had understood that the key was mechanical simplicity. A system with fewer moving parts had fewer failure modes, and a system that needed no power had nothing to run out of. His designs influenced virtually all subsequent wind vane systems. The mathematics of sleeping offshore are worth sitting with for a moment. A boat making 5 knots covers 15 nautical miles in 3 hours. A solo sailor sleeping for 3 hours while crossing an ocean shipping lane is traveling blind through 15 miles of potentially busy water. This is why solo sailors crossing major shipping routes spend their off-watch time not in deep sleep but in light dozing, waking frequently to scan the horizon, checking the AIS receiver that shows other ships' positions, alert to any change in the boat's motion that suggests a wind shift or a squall building. In open ocean, away from shipping, the mathematics are more relaxed. A boat in the middle of the North Atlantic is in water that may see one other vessel every 24 hours. A 3-hour sleep is genuinely safe. The wind vane is steering. The compass is recording the track. The horizon is empty. The night is full of stars. It is the most specific kind of alone that exists. A human being in a small boat, somewhere in the middle of an ocean at 2 a.m. with a mechanical system, steering them through the dark. While they sleep in a narrow bunk, the sound of water against the hull, a few centimeters from their ear, the boat doing everything correctly without anyone being awake to watch. The wind vane does not know the time. The boat does not know the time. The ocean certainly does not. And in this particular kind of alone, the fact that time is not being tracked by anyone turns out to be one of the most deeply restful things about it. Of all the points of sail described in the 3rd chapter, close hauled, close reach, beam reach, broad reach, running. The beam reach is the one that sailors return to in their memories most often. The wind is at 90 degrees to the boat's heading. The sails are eased to approximately halfway out from the boat's centerline, not hauled in flat against the boat, as they are when close hauled, not let right out as they are when running, but at a natural, relaxed angle that corresponds to the wind's position on the beam. The boat is upright or close to it. The healing force that makes close-hauled sailing a physical experience, with the cockpit tilted and spray occasional, is largely absent. The hull is moving at close to its best speed, because the beam reach produces strong aerodynamic drive from the sails, while also keeping the hull in its most efficient attitude. The helm is balanced. This is the detail sailors mention most when they describe a good beam reach. The tiller or wheel requires almost no input. The forces on the hull from the wind, the keel, and the water are so well matched at this angle that the boat wants to hold its course without being told. A light touch on the tiller is all that is needed, or none at all. The boat is doing it on its own. The bow wave is steady, at a consistent speed, on a consistent heading. The wave pattern at the bow is regular and predictable, a clean line of white, where the hull parts the water, trailing back on both sides. The sound of the boat through the water at this point of sail has a particular quality. Faster than close-hauled, quieter than crashing through steep upwind waves, more purposeful than the rocking of a downwind run. It is the sound of something moving efficiently through the world with minimal waste. In warm latitudes, on a beam reach with a trade wind on your quarter, the experience is one of the most complete and quiet pleasures that sailing offers. The air is warm, the sun angle is comfortable, the spray, if there is any, is warm too. The autopilot or wind vane handles the steering. The sails are pulling correctly without adjustment. The boat is making good miles toward wherever it is going. There is nothing to do, and nothing to worry about, and nothing to anticipate except more of the same, hour after hour across the water. The origin of the phrase about sailing being the second most pleasurable experience known to humanity is not clearly attributed, but the first person who said it was almost certainly on a beam reach. What happens inside the body on a beam reach is worth noting. The boat's motion at this point of sail is smooth and periodic, a gentle roll with each swell that passes under the hull, steady and rhythmic, rather than sudden and unpredictable. This motion acts on the vestibular system, the inner ear's balance apparatus, in a way that is well below the threshold of discomfort for most people, and above the threshold of stimulation for the mechanism that promotes sleep. The same gentle rocking motion that puts infants to sleep is produced in a more complex and sustained form by a well-found sailing boat on a beam reach in moderate conditions. The sound environment reinforces this. The water noise is consistent. The rigging hum is consistent. There are no sudden changes in pitch or volume because the conditions are not changing. The brain, which is constantly monitoring its auditory environment for changes that might indicate threat, finds nothing to monitor and gradually steps down its vigilance level. The parasympathetic nervous system takes over from the sympathetic. The body's alert posture relaxes. This is not an incidental feature of the beam reach. It is one of the reasons why sailors who spend long periods offshore describe the experience as restorative, in a way that shore-based rest is not. The boat provides all the signals that tell the body to rest, and removes almost all the signals that tell it to stay alert. The combination is very specific and very effective. There is a horizon all the way around. The sky is doing what the sky does. The sails are full. The water is a steady sound behind the hull. Nothing is required of you right now. The boat knows what it is doing. You can let it. Before Francis Beaufort devised his scale in 1805, one naval officer's gale was another's fresh breeze. This was not just a semantic problem, it was a practical one. The Royal Navy required officers to record weather observations in their ship's logs, because these logs were submitted to the Admiralty and used for navigation planning, route analysis, and court-martial evidence. An accurate record of conditions at sea mattered. But when one captain wrote strong wind and another wrote moderate gale to describe what might have been identical conditions, the records were useless for comparison. There was no shared language. Beaufort, then, a commander serving on HMS Woolwich, recorded the first draft of his scale in his private logbook on January 13, 1806. He had been working on the idea since 1805. His key insight was that a numerical description of wind force needed to be anchored to something objective and observable, something that any trained naval officer could assess consistently, regardless of their personal threshold for what felt strong or moderate. He chose sail. Specifically, he chose the sail plan of a fully rigged man-of-war, the standard Royal Navy ship of the line. At force 0, dead calm, a man-of-war would be motionless, all her canvas hanging limp. At force 1, a light air, she could just barely make steerage way. At force 2, a light breeze, she could make 1 to 2 knots. At force 6, a strong breeze, she would have double reefed her topsails and taken in her top gallants. At force 12, a hurricane, no sail would be possible. The anchor would be down, and the crew would be praying. The genius of the system was that every Royal Navy officer knew exactly what a man of war could carry in a given wind. They had lived with these sail plans for years. The question was not, how strong does this wind feel, but what sail would the fleet be carrying in this wind? The answer was objective and consistent across every officer who had served on square, rigged ships. In 1838, by which point Beaufort had become the Admiralty's hydrographer of the Navy, the scale was made mandatory for all Royal Navy log entries. From that point, weather observations across the fleet began to accumulate into a consistent, comparable dataset for the first time. In 1874, the International Meteorological Committee adopted the scale for international weather telegraphy, and it spread beyond naval use to civilian meteorology. In 1926, the committee finally assigned actual wind speeds in miles per hour to each force number. The scale runs from 0 to 12 in its standard form, with extensions to Force 17 added in 1946 for extreme tropical conditions. Force 0 is calm. Smoke rises vertically. The sea surface is mirror flat. Force 4, a moderate breeze at 13 to 18 knots, raises small waves with some whitecaps, what most sailors would describe as a pleasant day on the water, comfortable for most boats, requiring no reefing. Force 6, a strong breeze at 25 to 31 knots, raises large waves with extensive white foam crests. Experienced sailors begin to consider reducing sail, and the boat starts to feel the conditions more significantly. Force 8, a gale at 34 to 40 knots, produces moderately high waves with breaking crests and streaks of foam blown across the water. This is serious weather, and most coastal sailors would not choose to be out in it. Force 10, a storm, is beyond the experience of most recreational sailors, and represents conditions in which the sea becomes white with spray and foam, and the waves take on the large, irregular character of a true ocean storm. The scale's longevity reflects the quality of the original idea. More than 2 centuries after Beaufort wrote his first draft in a private logbook on a ship in the Royal Navy, every marine weather forecast in the world still uses his numbers. A Force 4 today means exactly what it meant to the officer who set his sails by it in 1810. A Force 8 gale warning issued to shipping carries the same quantitative meaning that it carried when the man of war would have been taking in her topgallants and checking her anchors. The vocabulary that sailors use to talk about the wind is Beaufort's vocabulary. When they say, "It was blowing a good force 5, they are using a measurement system devised on a wooden warship by a young Irish-born commander who wanted the Navy's weather records to actually be useful. It is still being used tonight. It will still be used tomorrow. It is 2 in the morning. The watch begins without ceremony. The off-watch sailor, who has been asleep in the quarter berth for 3 hours, is shaken gently by the shoulder. They sit up, check the clock, pull on a fleece and oilskin jacket, and make their way through the dark companionway into the cockpit. The watchkeeper they are relieving gives a brief handover. Course is 220 degrees magnetic. Wind is Force 4. Steady from the northwest. No shipping in sight. Speed is 6 knots. 1 ship passed astern an hour ago. the logs and GPS position are noted. Then, the off-watch watchkeeper goes below, strips off their oilskins, and lies back down in the warm bunk. The new watchkeeper sits with the boat. This is sailing's most elemental experience, and it happens in the dark. Offshore sailing does not stop at night. There is no anchorage to run to when the sun goes down, no pause until the light returns. The boat is committed to the ocean, and the ocean does not keep office hours. It keeps the watch in 3-hour shifts, taking turns with whoever is aboard, because someone must always be here, watching. In the first minutes of the watch, the eyes adjust. The cockpit instruments glow softly. The chart plotters blue light. The instrument displays in their amber, the compass card illuminated by a dim red light that preserves night vision. Beyond the cockpit, the sea is not black, but a dark shifting surface of blues and greys, the waves catching the sky's light in ways that make it possible, after some minutes, to see their scale and direction. The horizon is a soft boundary between the darkness of the sea and the only slightly lighter darkness of the sky. The stars are exceptional. Far from land, away from any light pollution, the Milky Way is not a concept but a physical presence, a dense band of stars arching across the sky from horizon to horizon, so bright that it casts a faint shadow when you know where to look for it. The Southern Cross for sailors in the Southern Hemisphere, Polaris in the north. The same navigational stars that the clipper captains used, the same stars that the Egyptian traders used before them, the same stars that are overhead tonight in this unchanged and unchangeable arrangement. The bioluminescence is visible if you lean over the rail and look at the bow wave. Tiny, single-celled organisms called dinoflagellates, disturbed by the boat's passage, flash with a cold blue-green light that is produced by a chemical reaction requiring no heat and no external energy source. The bow wave glows. The wake behind the boat is lit from within, a trail of cold fire that extends for some distance behind, before fading into the dark. Every wave the boat creates has this quality in the right conditions, and the effect is to make the boat appear to be sailing through a world that is generating its own light. The ocean at night is not silent. There is the wind, steady or variable. There is the water on the hull, its pitch telling you the speed. There is the creak of the rigging when a gust comes through. And then, occasionally, something else, a cetacean surfacing nearby. The sound of a breath, sharp and purposeful, followed by a smooth black shape, briefly visible in the water. Dolphins at night make a sound that is halfway between a splash and a sigh. Whales are different. A single exhalation carries farther than you would expect, and the sound of it, close in the dark, is one of those experiences that is difficult to describe afterward. At some point in the watch, an hour in, perhaps, when the routine is established, and the scan of the horizon has become automatic, something else happens. The particular alertness required by the watch becomes its own kind of quiet. You are paying attention to everything, which means your attention is spread evenly across the whole environment, rather than focused on any single thing. Your thoughts do not accumulate. You notice them rising and passing, like the waves, one after another, without holding any of them. The sea does this to people on watch. It has been doing it for thousands of years. The 3 hours ends. The boat is still at 220 degrees. The wind is still force 4. The sea is still the sea. You go below and sleep the sleep of someone who has been genuinely awake. Between roughly 5 degrees north and 5 degrees south of the equator, the wind stops. Not everywhere, not all at once, and not forever, but reliably, stubbornly, and with no predictable schedule for when it will return. The band of ocean circling the Earth near the equator produces some of the most frustrating sailing conditions in existence. Sailors have a name for this zone that has passed into everyday language as a metaphor for stagnation. They call it the doldrums. The meteorological name is the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or IT. The physics behind it are simple. Near the equator, the sun strikes the ocean surface at a near vertical angle throughout the year, heating the water to temperatures that warm the air directly above it. Warm air rises. As it rises, it carries androus moisture, which condenses into the towering cumulonimbus clouds that are the most visible feature of the itch. From a distance, vertical columns of cloud rising to 15 kilometers or more, visible for hundreds of miles on a clear day. The air that rises in the itch is replaced at the surface by air flowing in from both hemispheres. The northeast trade winds flowing from the north, the southeast trade winds flowing from the south. These trade winds are the reliable, predictable breezes that made oceanic trade routes possible, and we will meet them in the next chapter. But here in the convergence zone, they meet and rise together, and at the surface they cancel each other out. The result is not a simple calm. The doldrums are more unpredictable and more trying than dead calm would be. They produce alternating periods of glassy stillness and violent, short-lived squalls. The sky, which is often overcast with convective cloud, delivers intense tropical downpours with almost no warning. Between squalls, the sea surface is greasy and motionless, the sails hanging limp, the boat sitting in whatever direction the current takes it, while the engine, if there is one, burns fuel. At a rate, the crew watches anxiously. Then a line of black cloud appears on the horizon, a squall approaching with 25 or 30 knots of wind in its leading edge, and there is a scramble to reef the sails before it hits, followed by a few minutes of intense sailing in a direction that may be completely wrong for the intended route, and then calm again. For the sailing ships of the 17th through 19th centuries, the doldrums were a serious problem. A square-rigged ship becalmed in the itch could sit for weeks, its provisions slowly diminishing, its crew suffering from heat and inactivity, its captain studying the sky and the sea for any sign of a filling breeze. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's 1798 poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Water, water, everywhere, nor any drop to drink, is set in a becalmed ship in tropical waters. And the psychological deterioration it describes is not purely poetic invention. Prolonged calms at sea have a quality, unlike almost any other enforced inactivity. The boat is in the right place for sailing, the crew is ready, the destination is known, but the essential ingredient is simply absent. Modern sailors with engines can motor through the doldrums, and most do, timing their crossing, when satellite weather analysis suggests the it is narrow. The width of the zone varies seasonally, and from year to year, ranging from 100 miles to several hundred. Experienced ocean sailors time their Atlantic or Pacific passages to cross when the zone tends to compress. In the Atlantic, typically somewhere between 20 and 30 degrees west longitude during the northern hemisphere autumn. But even with an engine, the doldrums are instructive. They are the place where the ocean refuses to cooperate, where the weather that has been reliable for 1,000 miles becomes erratic and contradictory. They are the seam between the two halves of the world's wind system, and crossing them is a reminder that the trade winds waiting on the other side were not permanent features of some static universe. They were and are gifts. You cross the doldrums to earn them. The word itself entered English from the sailing world. In the doldrums became a way to describe a person or situation that had stalled, lost momentum, gone quiet. The equatorial convergence zone named the feeling before the feeling needed naming. On the other side of the doldrums, the wind comes back. And when it comes back, it is one of the most reliable winds on Earth. The trade winds blow from the northeast in the northern hemisphere and from the southeast in the southern hemisphere, flowing toward the equator in a belt that extends from roughly 5 to 30 degrees latitude on each side. Their name comes from the Old English word trade, meaning a steady or regular course, not from commerce, as is commonly assumed, though they served commerce for centuries. They are the reason Christopher Columbus was able to cross the Atlantic in 1492. They are the reason Arab does have crossed the Indian Ocean for more than 1,000 years. They are the most consistently useful winds in the history of ocean navigation. The physics that produce them are the counterpart of the physics that produce the doldrums. As warm air rises in the equatorial convergence zone, it spreads outward at altitude, moving toward higher latitudes where it cools and descends in a broad band centered around 30 degrees. This descending air creates the subtropical high-pressure systems. The Azores High in the North Atlantic, the Pacific High in the North Pacific. The air descending in these systems flows back toward the equator at the surface, completing the circulation loop. The Earth's rotation deflects this surface flow to the right in the northern hemisphere and left in the southern, producing the consistent northeasterly and southeasterly directions that define the trades. For a sailing boat, the trade wind passage is one of the defining experiences of ocean sailing. Coming out of the doldrums, the trade wind fills in from behind as the boat crosses into the belt. The sails go up, the engine goes off. The boat accelerates onto a broad reach or a run, the wind steady on the quarter at 15 to 20 knots, the sea building into the long, regular swell that the trades generate over thousands of miles of fetch. And then it stays like this, day after day, for as long as the passage takes. The classic trade wind passage for Atlantic sailors is from the Canary Islands off the coast of northwest Africa to the Caribbean. Approximately 700 miles that can be completed in as little as 2 weeks in a fast boat. The wind is steady, the swell is long and regular. The sky is clear except for the occasional trade wind cumulus, small, white, flat-bottomed clouds that form as the moisture in the trade air rises and condenses. The temperature is warm. The nights are clear. There is nothing to do except trim the sails once a day, eat, sleep, read, and watch the water. It is in the trades that sailors most often describe the specific quality of offshore passage-making that is not available anywhere else, the complete absorption in the present moment that comes from a boat making good progress in steady conditions, far from land, with no particular news from the world behind, and no particular urgency about the world ahead. The watch structure provides rhythm, the steady wind provides continuity, the ocean provides scale. Together they produce an environment where the small anxieties that accumulate in daily life have nowhere to attach themselves and gradually dissolve. Columbus used the northeast trades to cross to the New World in 36 days, in 1492, running downwind across the Atlantic from the Canary Islands. He then used the westerlies, the returning arm of the same circulation system at higher latitudes, to sail back to Europe. He had discovered, without fully understanding the atmospheric physics, the most efficient sailing route between the continents. Sailors still visit it today. The route has not changed because the wind has not changed. The Azores High sits in the same position it occupied in 1492, generating the same northeast trades, and every November the Atlantic Rally for Cruisers sends several hundred boats from the Canaries to the Caribbean on precisely the same downwind run that Columbus sailed. The ocean accommodates all of them. It has been doing so for a long time. There is a condition at sea that sailors describe with more feeling than almost any other. It has none of the drama of a gale. It does not damage equipment or test seamanship. It requires no urgent action and carries no immediate danger. And yet sailors who have experienced it speak of it with a peculiar intensity, as something that gets under the skin in a way that storms do not. A boat becalmed, no wind, no steerage, the sails hanging in loose, shapeless folds, their sheets slack, the boom swinging gently with each roll of the swell. The boat moving only in the slow, irregular rhythm of the ocean's underlying pulse, the swell that travels across open water from whatever weather system generated it hundreds of miles away, arriving here as a long, smooth surface motion that has no corresponding wind. The sea surface in a flat calm is unlike anything else in nature. When there is no wind to disturb it, the ocean smooths out to an almost frictionless plain, and whatever light is available, sunrise, noon sun, the diffuse glow of an overcast sky, is reflected uniformly back from the surface without the texture that wind-ruffled water would create. A perfectly calm tropical sea at noon looks like molten aluminium. A perfectly calm sea at sunset looks like the sky has fallen. A perfectly calm sea at night looks like no sea at all. A void that continues the darkness upward without interruption. Ancient sailors feared calms as much as they feared storms. The becalmed ship was not in danger of sinking, but it was in danger of running out of time. And in an era when provisions were finite and destinations had fixed schedules, time was life. A ship becalmed in the tropics in the era, before refrigeration faced deteriorating food, brackish water, crew sickness from the heat, and the specific psychological deterioration that comes from being in exactly the right place for your intended purpose, with no ability to exercise that purpose. You cannot will wind into existence. You cannot improvise a substitute. You simply wait. Modern sailors with engines have removed the existential threat of the calm. But they have not removed the experience itself. The engine solves the logistical problem. It does not solve what a calm feels like. There is still the hanging sail, the still surface, the quality of light that belongs only to windless days at sea, the particular silence that takes over the boat when the water noise stops, and the rigging falls quiet. In this silence, sounds become very specific. The drip of condensation from the boom end into the cockpit, the knock of the boom against the mainsheet block as the boat rolls, the soft exhale of the hull, moving through still water at minimum speed, the breathing of the crew. Sailors who have spent time becalmed often describe a quality of attention that it produces, different from the busy attention of sailing in wind. There is nothing to trim, nothing to adjust, nothing to watch for, except a change in the conditions that might not come for hours. The mind, deprived of the task of sailing, turns outward to the water and the sky, and inward to whatever is there when there is nothing specific to do. Some sailors find this deeply uncomfortable. Others find it the most restorative part of a long passage. The becalmed sea is what the ocean looks like when it is not performing. The waves are the ocean under wind. The swell is the ocean's memory of wind from somewhere else. But the flat, calm surface in no wind conditions is the ocean in its own state, not driven by anything, not going anywhere. It is old water that has been here longer than any human institution, water that holds no record of ships, of cargo, of war, of passage. The boat floats on it without marking it. The light moves across it, and it reflects the light back unchanged. The day passes, and the water holds its position. Everything else can wait. In 1968, the Sunday Times newspaper announced a challenge, a trophy, and £5,000 for the first person to sail around the world solo, non-stop, without any assistance. The start window was open between June 1 and October 31 of that year. The route had to go via the three great capes, Good Hope, Lewin, and Horn. There were no other rules. 9 sailors entered. 1 came back. Robin Knox Johnston was 29 years old and worked as a merchant seaman when he read the announcement. He had no sponsor, little money, and a boat that most sailing commentators considered unsuitable for the task. A 32-foot teak-planked Bermudan ketch named Suhaili, built in Bombay in 1963 to a design intended for coastal sailing, not Southern Ocean circumnavigation. He entered anyway, partly because the idea was irresistible, and partly because he believed a well-found traditional wooden boat was more survivable in extreme conditions than a lightweight racing machine. He departed Falmouth on June 14, 1968. He was the third of the 9 starters to leave. The voyage that followed was 312 days long. Knox Johnston lost his self-steering gear off the coast of Australia, which meant hand steering or lashing the tiller for weeks at a time. He repaired underwater hull damage while treading water in the Southern Ocean. He lost all radio contact for an extended period, leaving his family and the race organizers uncertain for months whether he was still alive. He rounded Cape Horn on January 17, 1969, and turned north. Of the 8 other competitors, none finished. Nigel Tetley, sailing a trimaran, sank after pushing his boat too hard in an attempt to beat Knox Johnston home. Bernard Mortessier, who was in 2nd place and sailing the fastest passage, deliberately sailed away from the finish line. He sent a message via slingshot to a passing ship. "I am continuing non-stop towards the Pacific Islands, because I am happy at sea and perhaps also to save my soul." He eventually stopped in Tahiti after sailing more than 1.5 times around the world. Donald Crowhurst, who had fabricated position reports while sailing in circles in the Atlantic, rather than making the Southern Ocean crossing, was found dead, his trimaran abandoned. The evidence in his logs suggested a complete psychological disintegration over the months of deception and isolation. Knox Johnston arrived back in Falmouth on April 22, 1969. He was the sole finisher of a race that 9 people had started. He donated his prize money to the family of Donald Crowhurst. Suhaili was 32 feet long, significantly smaller than Chichester's 53-foot gypsy moth, Ivy. She was slower and less equipped. She had no sophisticated electronics, and her self-steering proved unreliable for much of the voyage. What she had was a sound wooden hull, a skipper who could repair her at sea, and sufficient provisions to sustain 1 person for the better part of a year. The difference between Chichester's voyage in 1966-67 and Knox Johnston's in 1968-69 is the difference between a circumnavigation with 1 stop and a circumnavigation with none. Chichester stopped in Sydney for 5 weeks. Knox Johnston stopped nowhere. He was at sea continuously, without setting foot on land for 312 days. The psychological dimension of this is difficult to fully convey. Francis Chichester had Sydney as a waypoint, a period of rest, human contact, and reprovisioning. Knox Johnston had the ocean all the way around. When he stepped ashore at Falmouth, he had been at sea for more than 10 months. The official record stated simply that he was the first human being to sail around the world alone without stopping. Suhaili is still afloat. Knox Johnston, born in 1939, has sailed in offshore races into his 80s. The boat outlasted the race, and the race created something that has not stopped. The question of what a person, a small boat, and a sufficient quantity of ocean are capable of together when there are no alternative options. The boat at anchor in our opening chapter was swinging with the tide. The tide itself runs on a schedule older than any clock, the schedule of the moon. Tides are produced primarily by the gravitational pull of the moon on the Earth's oceans. The moon's gravity draws the ocean water toward it, creating a bulge of water on the side of the Earth facing the moon. On the opposite side of the Earth, a second bulge forms, caused by the centrifugal effect of the Earth-Moon system rotating about its common center of mass. As the Earth rotates within these 2 tidal bulges, any given point on the ocean's surface passes through 2 high tides and 2 low tides every lunar day. A lunar day is not the same as a solar day. The moon orbits the Earth in the same direction that the Earth rotates on its own axis. This means the Earth has to rotate slightly more than 1 full turn for any given point to line up with the moon again. The extra rotation takes approximately 50 minutes. A lunar day is therefore 24 hours and 50 minutes long, not 24 hours. High tides occur 12 hours and 25 minutes apart. And because the lunar day is 50 minutes longer than the solar day, high tide arrives approximately 50 minutes later each day than it did the day before. This 50-minute daily shift is one of the first things a sailor learns about tidal harbours. The high tide that came at noon today will come at 12:50 tomorrow and at 1:40 the day after. Tidal tables, which list predicted high and low water times and heights for every port, computed years in advance from the astronomical constants that govern the moon's orbit, are among the most used reference publications in coastal sailing. Planning a departure through a tidal gate, a narrow channel or harbour entrance where the current runs strongly, and the prudent navigator times the pass with the tide, requires knowing not just the predicted times, but the expected current direction and speed at every hour of the tidal cycle. The difference between spring tides and neap tides adds another layer. Twice each lunar month, at new moon and full moon, the sun, moon, and earth align. The gravitational pulls of the sun and moon combine, producing tides with higher high water and lower low water than average. These are spring tides, named not for the season, but from the concept of the tide springing forth. 1 week later, at the first and third quarter moon, the sun and moon are at right angles to each other. Their gravitational forces partially cancel each other, and the tidal range reduces. These are neap tides. The cycle from spring to neap and back repeats twice each lunar month without exception, as regular as the moon itself. For coastal sailors, the spring neap cycle determines what is accessible. A shoal patch with 2 meters of water at high water springs might have only 1.2 meters at high water neaps. A marina that can be entered on any tide in spring conditions might require careful timing at neaps. The entire character of a coastal anchorage changes as the tidal range varies through the fortnight. Tidal currents are the practical consequence of all this. As water is pushed and pulled by the tidal forces, it flows from areas of high water toward areas of lower water, through straits and around headlands, producing currents that can run at 3, 4, 5, or in extreme cases, more than 6 knots in confined channels. Against such a current, a sailboat making 4 knots through the water may make no progress over the ground at all. With it, the same boat covers ground at 9 or 10 knots without any additional wind. Understanding the tides is not navigational refinement for the coastal sailor. It is fundamental to whether you arrive at all. The anchor chain in the opening chapter hung in its catenary, the boat swinging as the tide turned. The lunar day moved it once in each direction, just as it has moved every anchored boat in every tidal harbour, since boats and tidal harbours first coincided. The tide does not consult anybody. It simply runs on its schedule, indifferent to plans. A sailboat's speed is measured in knots. 1 knot is 1 nautical mile per hour. A nautical mile is 1,852 meters, or approximately 1.15 land miles. A typical cruising sailboat on a moderate passage makes between 5 and 7 knots. At 6 knots, it covers about 144 nautical miles in a day, 265 kilometers. At this speed, a transatlantic passage takes approximately 18 to 20 days. A circumnavigation of the globe Approximately 24,000 nautical miles, if you follow a reasonable route, takes roughly 160 days of sailing. These are the unremarkable arithmetic facts of how sailing boats move through the world. The word knot itself comes from a navigational practice that predates all electronic instrumentation. Before GPS, before speed logs, before any instrument that could measure velocity through water directly, the way to calculate a ship's speed was to throw a piece of wood overboard and count how many knots in the rope trailing from it passed through your hands in a fixed period of time. The piece of wood was called the chip log or the common log. It was a flat triangular board, weighted at one edge, so it would float vertically in the water and resist being pulled forward, remaining approximately stationary as the ship moved past it. The rope attached to it was tied at regular intervals. The intervals were approximately 14.4 meters apart, and the rope was allowed to run freely through the hands for 28 seconds, timed by a sand glass. The number of knots that passed through the hands in those 28 seconds gave the ship's speed in nautical miles per hour. The mathematics of this are elegant. At 1 nautical mile per hour, a ship covers 1,852 meters in 3,600 seconds. In 28 seconds, it covers 14.4 meters, which is exactly the spacing of the knots in the log line. The system was self-consistent and portable, requiring nothing more than a piece of wood, a knotted rope, and a sand glass that any carpenter could make. The average cruising speed of 5 to 7 knots is, in the scheme of all nautical history, not slow. A Victorian clipper ship could average 10 to 12 knots on a good passage and occasionally exceed 17. A modern racing yacht with a skilled crew in strong conditions can sustain 15 to 20 knots, and the fastest ocean racing multi-hulls can exceed 40. The world speed record for a sailing vessel, set by the Australian craft Vestas Sail Rocket 2 in 2012, stands at 45 knots, nearly 121 kilometers per hour, achieved over a 500-meter course. This is not a comfortable or quiet experience. It is the extreme end of what can happen when sail technology, hull design, and conditions converge. But the 6-knot passage is the experience that the vast majority of offshore sailors know. 6 knots across the ocean. The bow wave at that speed makes a particular sound, a consistent, unhurried hiss. That becomes the background note of a passage. The wake stretches back in a widening V, the boat's signature on the water immediately erased by the next swell. The log ticks up the miles one by one. There is no urgency to this speed. It is not slow enough to be frustrating in good conditions, and not fast enough to be alarming. It is a travelling speed that the human body, lying in a bunk below, fully accommodates. The motion is predictable. The noise is consistent. The progress is happening, without anyone needing to push it. Francis Chichester averaged approximately 126 nautical miles per day on his circumnavigation, which works out to roughly 25 knots of sustained average. Robin Knox Johnston was somewhat slower in his heavier, older boat. Neither of these is remarkable by racing standards. Both are remarkable by any other standard. A single human being, sustained at sea for months, by nothing except wind and water and a knotted rope's worth of speed. A sail is a structure designed to turn wind into force. Everything about its construction, the fabric, the cut, the reinforcements, the hardware attaching it to the boat, exists to serve this one function as efficiently and durably as possible across the range of conditions it will encounter. And the material of which the sail is made determines, more than anything else, how well it does this job. The earliest sails were made from whatever material was available, and strong enough. Ancient Egyptian sails appear to have been woven from papyrus reed, matting, a logical choice in a civilization where papyrus was abundant and its weaving well understood. As Egyptian shipbuilding evolved from reed construction to wood, the sails evolved with it, moving toward woven linen, the same fabric used for clothing and wrapping, which remained the standard material for sails across the Mediterranean, whirled through the classical period and into the medieval era. Cotton canvas replaced linen as the dominant sail material through the 17th and 18th centuries, and it was the fabric of the great age of sail. The cotton canvas of the clipper ships, the same material that drove the Cutty Sark's 3 Zeus' squares meters of sail area, was a heavy, durable material that held its shape reasonably well when wet and could be repaired at sea by any competent sailmaker. It was also heavy, and it rotted if left wet for too long, and it stretched under load in ways that changed the sail's shape and reduced its efficiency. The art of the Victorian sailmaker was in cutting the panels of cotton canvas so that when the sail set under a load it was designed for, the overall shape produced optimal aerodynamic performance, despite the material's tendency to change under strain. The synthetic revolution came after the Second World War. Dacron, the brand name for a polyester fibre, entered sailmaking in the 1950s and transformed the industry. Polyester does not rot. It resists ultraviolet degradation far better than cotton. It stretches less under load. It is lighter. It can be woven to a consistent specification. The cruising sailboat of today uses Dacron as its standard sail material, and a well-made Dacron sail can last 15,000 to 20,000 miles of offshore sailing before the UV degradation and fatigue cycles in the weave begin to reduce its efficiency below the point of usefulness. For racing, where the marginal performance gains from a stiffer, lighter sail justify the cost, the materials move beyond woven fabrics entirely. Laminated sails, which sandwich load-bearing fibres, Kevlar, carbon fibre, Dyneema, Spectra, between layers of adhesive film, produce a sail that holds its designed shape across a much wider range of wind loads than any woven fabric can manage. The aerofoil shape that the sail designer intended when the cloth was cut is preserved under load because the load-bearing fibres are oriented precisely to resist the forces that would otherwise change the shape. A full racing laminate sail feels different from a Dacron sail. It is stiffer, lighter, and makes a different sound in the wind, a sharp, papery percussion rather than the soft flutter of woven cloth. In light air, it holds an aerofoil shape that a cotton or Dacron sail would not achieve because the material's own weight would cause it to sag. In heavy air, it maintains that shape, where a lesser sail would have distorted under the load, the leading edge twisting away from the optimum angle and losing aerodynamic efficiency. But the sound of a Dacron mainsail, full of wind on a beam reach, is its own thing, a deep, taut drum tone. The fabric stretched flat and resonant under the load, the leech fluttering slightly at the trailing edge where the airflow separates. It is not the sound of technology. It is the sound of air and fabric doing exactly what they were designed to do, in a relationship that has been going on in various material forms for 1,500 years. The wind does not care what the sail is made of. It simply pushes, and the sail pushes back, and the boat moves forward through the water at whatever number of knots. The combination of wind, fabric, and hull design produces on this particular day. The day has been good. A steady force 4 from the southwest, the boat close reachings across a moderate swell, making 7 knots and a little more in the gusts. The coast has been visible for the past 2 hours, a dark line low on the eastern horizon that has slowly resolved into hills, and then into cliffs, and then into the familiar shape of the headland that marks the entrance to the anchorage. The sky is clear. The sun is declining toward the hills behind the cove, and the light on the water has shifted from the flat white of afternoon to the warmer directional gold of late day. The engine starts. It will run only briefly, long enough to motor the last half-mile under control, with the sails down, into the shelter of the cove. The mainsail comes down first. The halyard is released. The sail drops. The crew gathers it on top of the boom and wraps it loosely in the sail ties. The jib follows, rolled on the forestay and secured. The sound of the boat changes immediately. The wind noise in the rigging drops, as the sails are removed from the equation, and the dominant sound becomes the engine at low revs and the water off the bow. The cove is sheltered. The hills come down on 3 sides, and the water inside is noticeably calmer than the open sea outside. 2 other boats are already at anchor here, a blue-hulled ketch with a French flag, swinging on a short scope, and a white sloop with her dinghy trailing astern. They are far enough apart that there is room for a third. In the eastern corner, where the bottom is sand at around 4 meters, the bow approaches the anchor spot. The engine goes to idle. The helmsman calls the depth 4.2 meters, which means the anchor chain will go down about 4 meters before it reaches the bottom. At a scope of at least 5:1, approximately 20 meters of chain should be deployed. The windlass releases the chain in stages. 5 meters, then 10, the boat nudging backward gently, then 15, then 20. The engine goes briefly astern to set the anchor, to drive it into the sand and confirm it is holding rather than skating. The boat stops. The chain tightens and holds. The engine goes off. The silence that follows is not absolute. There is the ambient sound of the cove. Water against the hull, wind in the rigging, the distant sound of something on shore, birds in the hills behind. But after a day of sailing, the continuous sound of the boat underway, the engine for the last half-mile, this is a different quality of quiet. The mechanical note is gone. The urgency is gone. The boat is no longer travelling somewhere. It is here. Below decks, someone lights the stove to heat water for tea. The sound of the kettle is domestic and ordinary and completely correct. The boat rocks very slightly in the small swell that enters the cove from the south. a periodic motion that will slow as the evening progresses, and the sea state settles with the dying of the day's wind. The anchor chain shifts slightly on the seabed as the boat adjusts its position to the tide and the diminishing breeze. On deck, the last light is moving up the hills. The cliffs that were in shadow are now lit from a low angle that makes their texture vivid. The individual ledges and cracks, the patches of grass on the steeper faces, the streak of white where a waterfall comes down from somewhere above. A cormorant lands on a rock near the entrance, stands with its wings spread in the last warmth, and then folds them. The anchor light goes on at the bow. A white light visible all around, required by the regulations for vessels at anchor, showing any passing boat that this cove is occupied. In a few hours it will be dark, and the light will reflect in the water beneath it in a soft, elongated oval, the boat's own small beacon in the sheltered dark. The tea is ready, the kettle is still. The anchorage settles into evening. We began here, a boat at anchor in a sheltered cove as evening fell, the anchor chain in its catenary curve, the sails furled, the tide swinging the boat in its slow arc, twice in every 24 hours and 50 minutes, the moon doing its ancient work on the water below. Everything covered in the chapters between that opening and this one was already present in that boat. The sail fabric, whether dacron or laminate, descended in an unbroken line from the woven linen squares of the ancient Nile, the first sails drawn on a pottery vessel 5,000 years ago by someone who noticed that the north wind could be used to go upriver. The keel below the waterline, heavy with its ballast of lead, performing the same two functions, resisting leeway, providing righting moment, that every keelboat has relied on since the heavy fin was first developed. The anchor chain following the same catenary curve, calculated by the mathematician Huygens in 1690. Its mathematics unchanged since. The story of sailing is, in one sense, a story about the refinement of a single idea, that a cloth surface, properly shaped and oriented, can convert moving air into the motion of a vessel in any direction except directly into the wind. This idea was in the first Egyptian's square sail. It was in the fore and aft rig of the medieval latine. It was in the clipper's 3,000 square metres of canvas, in Chichester's ketch making 126 miles a day toward Cape Horn, in Knox Johnston's teak-built Suhaili, somewhere in the Southern Ocean, without any radio contact for 3 months. It is in the boat at anchor tonight, its sail furled but ready, the cloth waiting for wind that will come again with the morning. The physics of sailing has not changed. The wind still cannot be sailed into directly. The keel still resists leeway with the same hydrodynamic principle it always has. The trade winds still blow from the northeast in the northern hemisphere, generated by the same atmospheric circulation that Columbus read in 1492. The tides still run on the lunar schedule, 12 hours and 25 minutes between high waters, the moon doing its work regardless of what happens on the surface below. There is something deeply restful in this continuity, not the false comfort of things that will not change, but the actual comfort of things that demonstrably have not changed across 500 years of human use. The sail is one of the oldest technologies still in daily operation. The principles it relies on have been working reliably. Since before the first dynasty of Egypt, they will keep working after everyone alive. Tonight has gone. The boat at anchor knows none of this in any sense that could be articulated. It simply responds to the forces acting on it. The tide on the hull, the wind on the furled sail, the weight of the anchor chain pulling forward, the anchor holding in the sand below. It performs its physics without awareness or effort. It is a machine for converting the environment's energy into position and motion. And right now, the environment's energy is gentle, and the position it is holding is this quiet cove. And there is nothing more it needs to do. If you are listening to this as you fall asleep, you are in a boat of your own kind. A body that has been carrying you all day, responding to forces larger than itself, now coming to rest in its own anchorage. The chain is set, the anchor holds, the tide will swing the boat and swing it back, and in the morning the wind will be somewhere on the horizon, and the sail will fill, and the keel will do its work, and the water will say everything it has always said, which is, the physics are fine, the conditions are manageable. You can rest now. The night is settling. Everything is in its right place.